It was one of those evenings when the city seemed alive with noise and motion, yet for him the world felt distant and quiet. He walked steadily along the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, lost in thoughts of work, of the little worries that came with daily life. He had no idea that in the next few moments he would be thrown into a situation that would change not only someone else's path but his own as well. Ahead of him, near the dim street corner, a commotion stirred. People passed by quickly, pretending not to notice, as though their eyes could simply erase the sight if they ignored it. But he couldn't. Something in his chest tightened, forcing him to stop. There, caught in the middle of unease, stood a young woman. Fear clung to her expression, her eyes darting, her body tense. A small group of men surrounded her, their stance aggressive, their intentions clearly unkind. For a moment he hesitated. After all, she was a stranger, and stepping in could bring trouble he never asked for, but conscience has a way of pushing through hesitation. He could not bear to be one more passerby, one more face that pretended not to see. Without a second thought his pace quickened, and his stride grew firmer. As he approached, his voice rang out. Not loud, not angry, but steady, commanding enough to break the tension. The men turned to him, mocking, daring him to interfere. He knew he wasn't the strongest, and he knew the risk of stepping into someone else's fight, yet his heart refused to remain still. What happened next unfolded in seconds. He placed himself between the girl and the danger, his body shielding hers. His words were firm, his tone unshaken, and though the men laughed at first, something in his eyes told them he wouldn't back away. A few moments of confrontation stretched longer than they were, and finally the men dispersed, muttering and grumbling, but defeated by his determination. The girl's breathing was shallow, her hands clutched together as though she couldn't believe what had just happened. She stared at him with wide eyes, still caught between fear and relief. He turned to her gently, his face calm, his expression softening. He asked if she was all right, but he didn't press her for details. He didn't ask her name, didn't expect gratitude, didn't wait for her to explain. He simply made sure she was safe, and that the fear had loosened its grip. She wanted to speak, to say something that would capture the weight of what he had done. Her lips parted but no words came. How do you thank someone for stepping into the shadows of your life and pulling you out without hesitation? Before she could gather her thoughts, he gave her a reassuring nod, the kind that said, "You're safe now," and then he turned to leave. She almost reached out, almost asked him who he was, but her voice caught in her throat, and just like that he was gone, vanishing back into the crowd as though he had never been there. Yet the moment lingered, stretching far beyond those minutes on the street. For her, the rescue was not just about escaping harm. It was about the fact that someone had seen her when the whole world chose to look away. Strangers had passed by ignoring her silent pleas, but he had noticed, he had acted. He had given her hope that kindness still existed in its purest form, the kind that doesn't demand recognition. She watched the place where he had stood only seconds before, her heart racing, her eyes brimming with emotions she couldn't quite name: relief, gratitude, awe, and something deeper, a pull that told her this was not a memory she would ever forget. As she stood there gathering herself, one thought burned in her heart. He didn't know her name. He saved her without asking for it, without needing it. But she knew that one day, somehow, she would make sure he never forgot it. That night, as she finally walked away from the street corner, her steps unsteady but her resolve strong, she held on to the face of the man who had appeared like a silent guardian. A stranger, yes, but one whose single act had written itself into the pages of her life forever. Days slipped into weeks, yet her mind refused to let go of the memory of that night. Every time she walked past that street corner, every time the wind grew cold and the shadows seemed longer, she remembered him, the stranger who had stood between her and fear. His face was not one she had memorized fully. It was the feeling he left behind that she carried with her. The steadiness in his eyes, the calm strength in his voice, and the quiet assurance of his presence became etched in her heart. She replayed the scene over and over again, as if afraid that one day she might forget it. But forgetting was impossible, because what he had given her was more than safety. He had given her a reason to believe in people again. She wondered who he was. Did he live nearby? Was he married? A father? Someone with responsibilities and a family waiting for him at home? Or was he just like her, walking through life alone, quietly fighting his own battles? The more she thought, the more questions surfaced, but none had answers. She regretted not asking his name, not stopping him when he turned away so quickly. But in that moment, she had been too overwhelmed to speak. Gratitude had filled her, yet her voice had failed. That silence haunted her, as if she had let a chance slip away. She often sat by her window at night, staring at the empty street below, imagining him walking past. Perhaps he was out there, passing by without realizing how deeply his actions had impacted her. Perhaps to him it had been nothing more than an instinctive act, one he had already forgotten. That thought troubled her. How could he forget, when she could not erase it? How could something so monumental for her be just another fleeting moment for him? That question began to fuel a determination inside her. Slowly her feelings shifted from fear to gratitude, and from gratitude to resolve. She made a silent promise to herself that if destiny ever brought him back into her world, she would not let the opportunity slip by again. She would not remain the nameless woman he once saved. She would tell him who she was. She would thank him properly, and she would make sure he never forgot her name. This thought gave her a strange kind of strength, a quiet fire that kept her going. Everywhere she went, her eyes searched faces in the crowd. Whenever she passed a cafe or a busy street, her heart skipped, hoping she might see him again. The city was full of strangers, but none of them were him. Still she held on to hope. Life had a way of circling back, of creating moments when least expected. Perhaps fate was only testing her patience, waiting for the right time to reconnect two paths that had once crossed so unexpectedly. Her friends noticed a change in her. She smiled more often, though sometimes it carried a secret meaning they could not understand. They teased her, asked if she had met someone new, but she only shook her head. How could she explain that the one she thought about wasn't someone she even knew, that her heart carried the image of a man who had left before giving his name? She kept the story to herself, holding it close like a fragile secret, afraid that speaking of it aloud would somehow break its magic. But inside her the promise only grew stronger. If she ever saw him again she would not hesitate. She would step forward, she would speak, and she would give him her name. That name, she swore, would stay with him not as a burden but as a memory as unforgettable as the night he had changed her life. And so, even as the days continued to pass and life carried on with its ordinary rhythm, she lived with this quiet anticipation, this steady faith that their story was not finished. For him it might have been a moment lost in time. For her, it was the beginning of something waiting to unfold. She would not allow herself to remain invisible in his story. One day, when fate allowed, she would step into his world again, and she would make sure her name was a part of his forever. It was a quiet afternoon when life finally decided to surprise her. She had gone about her day like any Eddie, carrying books in her arms as she walked through the bustling market streets. The sun filtered down between buildings, the scent of roasted food lingered in the air, and the chatter of voices wrapped around her. It was ordinary in every way until she turned a corner and froze. There he was, the stranger, the man who had stood in front of her that night, the one whose memory had refused to fade. He was leaning casually against the side of a small shop, a bag in his hand, completely unaware that the very woman whose life he had once touched was standing only a few steps away. Her heart raced. For weeks she had imagined this moment, rehearsed it in her mind 100 times. But now, with him only a few feet from her, all her careful thoughts scattered. She almost convinced herself to turn around and walk away. What if he didn't remember her? What if to him she was just another face in the crowd? Another fleeting encounter? But then the promise she had made to herself burned in her chest. No, this was her chance. She could not let fear silence her again. Taking a breath, she stepped closer. He noticed her only when her shadow fell across him. His eyes lit, and for a second they simply stared at each other. Recognition flickered faintly across his face, as though a memory long buried was struggling to resurface. She spoke before doubt could swallow her courage. "Do you remember me?" Her voice was soft yet steady, carrying all the weight of the night she would never forget. He frowned slightly, searching her face, and then it came to him, the corner of the street, the frightened eyes, the men he had stood against. His expression softened, and he gave a small nod. "Yes," he said simply, the word carrying more warmth than she expected. Relief washed over her, and with it came a surge of boldness she had never felt before. She smiled faintly and whispered, "That night, you didn't even ask for my name. You just left." He shifted uncomfortably, his hand rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't need your name," he replied. "I just needed to make sure you were safe." His words struck her deeply. For him it had been about humanity, about instinct, not recognition. Yet for her it had become so much more. She leaned closer, her eyes holding his, and said with quiet conviction, "But I need you to know it. My name is—" And then she told him, carefully, as though each letter carried a piece of her heart. He repeated it slowly, almost reverently, like he was trying to carve it into memory. A small smile touched his lips, and she saw something change in his gaze. He wasn't the kind of man who expected gratitude, yet hearing her name seemed to shift the connection between them from strangers to something more. For the first time, they weren't just two people bound by an incident. They were two individuals standing face to face, acknowledged and seen. The conversation that followed was awkward at first. He didn't know what to say, and she didn't know how much of her gratitude to reveal without sounding overwhelmed. But slowly, words began to flow. She told him how much that night had meant to her, how it had restored her faith in kindness, and how she had wished for the chance to meet him again. He listened quietly, surprised, almost humbled. For him the act had been simple, something any decent person should do. But hearing the depth of her gratitude, he realized that what was small to him had been life-changing to her. The marketplace bustled around them, people moving, children laughing, vendors calling out, but for the two of them it felt like the world had paused. She had given him her name, and he had accepted it. What came next, neither of them could predict, yet both of them felt a quiet certainty that their paths had crossed again for a reason. She had fulfilled her promise to herself. She had made sure he would never forget her. As they parted that day, he spoke her name once more, almost as though testing its weight on his tongue. She smiled, knowing it had finally found its place in his memory. And as she walked away, she no longer felt like the frightened girl from that night. She felt stronger, braver, her story no longer just one of fear, but of connection, one that was only just beginning. Days turned into weeks after that unexpected reunion, but something had changed between them. The moment she had spoken her name aloud, it had been as though she had opened a door neither of them realized was there. For her it was the relief of finally being known, no longer the nameless girl saved on a cold night. For him it was a memory anchored with meaning, no longer a fleeting act of kindness but a story connected to a real person with a real name. Their encounters grew more frequent, not always planned but somehow inevitable. Sometimes they would cross paths in the market, exchanging brief smiles that lingered longer than they should. Other times she found herself walking near the street where it had all begun, only to see him there too, as though fate kept pulling them back to the place where their story had first started. Conversation came easier with each meeting. At first they spoke of simple things, work, the weather, the noise of the city, but slowly their words grew deeper, touching on fears, dreams and the hidden corners of their hearts. She often thought about how strange life was. If he hadn't been there that night, her world might have taken a darker turn. She might have lost her trust in people completely. Instead, his presence had not only protected her but also reshaped the way she saw life. And now, as she stood across from him in their small, ordinary moments, she realized she didn't just want to be remembered, she wanted to be part of his life in a way that couldn't be forgotten. He too found himself changed. For years he had lived quietly, never expecting recognition or gratitude for the little things he did. But meeting her again made him realize that his choices carried weight, that even simple actions could leave permanent marks on someone else's life. Her gratitude humbled him, but her presence did something more. It softened him. She brought warmth into the spaces of his world that had long been silent. One evening as they walked along a quiet street under the fading glow of sunset, she stopped suddenly and looked at him. "Do you know why I wanted you to remember my name?" she asked. He tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. She smiled faintly, her voice steady but tender. "Because that night you gave me back something I had lost, my faith in people, and I couldn't let you be just a nameless shadow in my story. You're part of who I am now, and I wanted to be part of your story too." From that day forward, they were no longer two strangers tied together by one act of kindness. They became friends, confidants, and slowly something more unspoken began to weave itself between them. Every time he spoke her name she felt it settle into her soul, proof that she was no longer forgotten. And every time she looked at him, she remembered the night that had changed everything, not because of fear but because of the courage of one man who didn't even know her name, and the determination of one woman who made sure he would never forget it.